Well, wonderful. Thank you for being here at this great event. Thanks, Occulture, for inviting me. And I hope you can hear me loudly and clearly. I think you can. As you can see, I've called this From Meetings with Remarkable Magicians to Introduction to Occulture. And it will become evident why. Some of you know me, some of you don't. Carl Abrahamsson from Sweden, and despite my better judgment or other hopes that I may have had, I have apparently become now a senior citizen in the realm of occulture. And depending on my daily form, it could vary from, yay, this is fantastic, to what the fuck happened? And the question is, am I a lifer, like a outlaw biker, in this occult quagmire? So it seems. Since I can't seem to run away from it, I have decided to run with it. And this is where I've ended up, on this stage. And that's okay. Actually, it's more than okay, because this beautiful conference is living proof that many of the ideas that I and earlier compatriots, collaborators, whatever, shared and developed are now manifest and very, very thriving, which is beautiful. But I am not here today to be only polite and nice and vanilla Swedish, but also to blatantly market two recent books. My magical memoir, Meetings with Remarkable Magicians, and the brand new, actually it's coming out in January, called Introduction to Occulture. Having two poles or point like these is great, because then you immediately have a kind of a trajectory for a story. So let's run with that. As I approached my second Saturn return, I was overwhelmed by COVID, lethargy. I decided it would be interesting to write my magical memoir, the history, to sum it all up, so that I could proceed into my third life phase with kind of clear hindsight. Maybe I had actually learned something from all the work and all the weirdness, and maybe this could also be interesting for others. And the more I jumped into my archive and actually started writing, the more overwhelmed I became. Yes, this is me, 1966. And when I posted this picture on Facebook 10 years ago, Michael G. Ray wrote, "Finally, we get to see what Rosemary's Baby looked like." But growing up in Stockholm, I was basically left to my own devices in a cultured home, including books, comics, music, art, writing, drawing. And you know what they say, the idle hands are the devil's workshop. Literally a proverbial saying. But in this enthusiastic idling, something emerged. Maybe it was the devil. Because I wanted to be in this bubble and just find out more stuff. Because the more I scraped the surface, the more occult stuff there was to be unearthed. And as we all know, teenagers love to individuate on their own terms, but always in some kind of opposition to parental authority. But my parents were weird escapists in their own right, so they just basically let me be. I started fanzines, and thereby awakening an appetite to write and take photos, and also to network with bands, artists, clubs, record labels, etc. And that was one very, very important foundation for me. It definitely empowered me, and it provided tools. And then there was the occult. The occult was cool. I read Crowley and LaVey and some historical stuff, finding the contrarian attitudes very useful and inspiring. And behind this, of course, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer. There was also a lot of things going on in the industrial music scene at this time and what was to follow. One of my favorite bands, Throbbing Gristle, turned into Psychick TV, who also had a magical order of their own, as you know, the Temple of Psychick Youth, or TOPY. Embedded in these experiments were massive references not only to occult philosophy, but also to weird art and key people who had carried forth the flame of Prometheus in a way over the centuries. Highly inspiring stuff for me, and of course I wanted to be part of it, as it was actually happening right there and then. traditional magic being pulled out of the historical hat and integrated in contemporary art and creativity. Genesis P-Orridge, who I had befriended in 1986 after having been a TOPY subscriber for a few years, coined the term occulture, and that was really it. I was hooked in the best possible way, abandoning all hopes and parental projections of a normal petit bourgeois trajectory. My business card in 1989 said occultural entrepreneur, and nothing much has changed. I worked with TOPY until its first phase disintegration, 1991-1992, including publishing the TOPY fanzine, Occulture, traveled with a film show called Visions of Occulture. I started the occultural journal, The Fenris Wolf, started a band called White Stains, and many other projects. White Stains' first record, which was a 12-inch single called Sweet Jane, told the story of Jane Mansfield's relationship with Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan. And this was all romantic fodder for my overheated mind at the time. And Genesis suggested that I should send this record to LaVey because they had recently met in San Francisco. And so I did, and received a wonderful letter back, including the information that I was now suddenly a member of the Church of Satan, which was satanic bliss for the young magician Carl. I was at this time also enrolled at Stockholm University doing film studies and was writing my thesis about Aleister Crowley's influence in Kenneth Anger's films. Anger was another occultural obsession of mine. Late 1989, I went to the US for the first time. Was cordially received by LaVey and his partner Blanche Barton at the Black House, and then zoomed on down to Hollywood to meet and interview, meet Kenneth Anger. And the thing that really sealed the deal, as they say, was that LaVey had called ahead to let his old friend Anger know that Carl is cool. So yeah, that was quite an intense trip that basically cleared the path for the rest of my life, leading to this very moment. And yeah, I also became a member of the O.T.O. in 1989 and organized the activities in Sweden for a long time, as I had done parallel with TOPY. Because, why not? If you're dipping your feet in the lovely pool of contemporary occulture and magic, why not dive in, which is what I did. I was also involved in a Golden Dawn group in Sweden and the US. Oh my God, this is so fast. That stemmed from Regardie's Stella Matutina experience or lineage, and it was interesting because, again, I found myself welcomed so quickly in these environments that I had previously only romanticized or daydreamed about. Doors weren't slowly being pried open by me. It was more like they were flung open and I was dragged in. I accepted that, and again, I ran with it. Then life happened, and I became a family man, a journalist, and an author. That changes things, of course, but my mind and a lot of the work was still focused on magic and occulture. And I kept building structures and making things happen within these structures, such as the O.T.O, for instance. The Fenris Wolf journal grew from being an occultural fanzine to a book series, and it still exists to this day. That has definitely been the consistent hub of many of the developments in my life. This sort of midpoint era also included a research project called Ordo Tibet, in which I traveled to Tibet, India, and Nepal with fellow magical anthropologists to find out more about Vajrayana Buddhism's views on ritual and magic specifically. This also included a stay at the Menri Bon Monastery in India, where I realized that the vibe there, and I mean not casually, but the actual vibration, absolutely bridged into other hardcore scapes and spaces that I'd been in to work, including the usually sealed-off temple space at Anton LaVey's Black House in San Francisco. Basically, what I think happened early on, and what I think would be the best takeaway from my life in general, is that I trusted my own intuition and also my passions, and never really questioned that. Meaning concretely that I was enamored by a certain kind of culture and also with occultism and magic, and decided that that was what I wanted to fill my life with. And not only that, I also presented or represented the material and the spirits that I had been inspired by for new audiences. Whether concerning trash culture and rock and roll in the fanzine I had called Lollipop, or occulture in the Fenris Wolf, writing and lecturing about pioneering people and minds at schools, universities, art colleges, etc. It became kind of like a modus operandi to share what I have found. And these platforms became talking points or springboards that opened up many other doors, many more than I could ever have anticipated. Lollipop and my TOPY subscription led to Genesis. My love for experimental film and Crowley led to Anger. Jen and my satanic infatuations led to LaVey, etc. And from this, it all snowballed even before the 80s had turned into the 90s. All of these seemingly unlikely things forged an identity, in part fully my own, and in part via projections from other people. And I have been totally fine with this, and I'm still happy to share and teach to the extent that I feel motivated to. However, it's important to separate the actual work from the apparent glamour that comes with lineages and keywords. Occultism is glamorous in itself. Satanism perhaps even more so. Sex magic perhaps even more so. So occult, satanic sex magic would be even more so. People see what they want to see. And this is both a strength and a weakness in which both watcher and watched dance around together. But the reality of magic, the machineries that really affect change in accordance with will, may not always be so glamorous. That's why I ascribe my successes more to a highly neurotic workaholism, in which I've often been neglectful or selfish, than to indulging in hocus-pocus escapisms. One of the things that attracted me to Genesis, even before we'd met, was exactly this rigorous work ethic and self-discipline. Yes, there was ritual magic and new ways of looking at it, such as weaving in Sparian sigils and Borosian cut-ups within traditional magic, but there was always an awareness that we, to a degree, shift things through changing the consciousness of other people. We need to reach out, hence culture, hence occulture, hence cultural engineering. Reality as we know it is considerably more malleable than we think and others assume. Change is definitely possible, but most likely if it comes from within ourselves and in a convincing, inspiring way to others. Gradually, a core philosophy manifested itself that really needs no name, but I've certainly called it many things anyway: occulture, Kunst und Geist, magico-anthropology, source magic, current 23, the 23rd mind, together with my lovely wife, Vanessa Sinclair, etc. It is a spirit that promotes individualism and tolerance, and it is also an active development of what I call existential technologies, which is basically the same as magical theory and practice. Things need to change, otherwise they become inert. My own tools and technologies and my own field of work has been culture itself, as that's where and how you really change things in the greater scheme of things. Not necessarily underground culture, although that is usually very fertile soil, but culture as such. That's where you sow seed and tend to the plants that eventually pop up. All of my main mentors had understood this early on and had used it for their own take or definition of this very same spirit. Anger with Thelema, LaVey with Satanism, and P-Orridge with Occulture. And I feel that I'm doing something similar with all my projects and projections, with the exception that I don't really have a superstructure that organizes group dynamics in, for instance, a classical magical order sense. I did at one point initiate something that I called the Society of Sentience, but it is much more of a think tank and network similar to TOPY than any kind of hierarchical structure. In 2019, I left the O.T.O after a solid 30 years. I didn't feel that the original thelemic resonance was there anymore for me, and there was seemingly nothing left for me to do inside the order structure. And I had also started noticing tendencies of rigid fundamentalism that I'm a bit allergic to. And in many ways, this coincided with the beginning of my second Saturn return as well. I felt a strong need to redefine myself in an honest way instead of just tagging along for a ride well known. When approaching this second Saturn return, I also wanted to pay back what I could to teachers and dear friends in order to be fully able to move on myself and carry on my own definitions. With Genesis, I made the documentary film called Change Itself, and also the interview book, Sacred Intent. And I also published Jen's own interviews with Brian Geisin, which was his own main magical mentor, called His Name Was Master. And when it came to Anger, I made the documentary film, Cinemagician. And when it came to LaVey, I made the documentary film, Into the Devil's Den, and the book, Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan. Plus other similar things for similar teachers and sources of inspiration. It not only felt good, it also made me realize that it's an absolute necessity in the magical tradition I'm working in to make sure that the spirit is fine and well taken care of so that it can roam freely onwards. In a way, pay back, pay forward. Genesis often talked about the touching of hands as both a symbolic and literal initiation between Brian Geisin and himself. And in many, perhaps most cases, the most valuable initiations are not technical or manuscript-based, but rather based on intuitive resonances that can be built on, which is what I've called resonances. Badges, certificates, medals, funny hats, and gobbledygook litanies in made-up languages usually lead nowhere. A hug and a handshake can be all the solidifying investment needed. If there is resonance, it can be built on. If there is resonance, the journey can begin. And if not, just travel on somewhere else and to someone else. In 2014, the beautiful publishers Scarlet Imprint published my first anthology of texts called Resonances. This was a defining moment or phase, as it not only collected existing essays and lectures, but also ignited new ones. At a conference in New York in 2016, someone said that I had become like the Umberto Eco of the occult underground, and that was surely fine with me. Then followed similar anthologies, Occulture, and Source Magic, and In Between the Lines. There is really nothing I love more than thinking and writing about all these weird things, and I'm very happy to be able to work with this on a daily basis now. And this leads on to book number 2, which is Introduction to Occulture. Will be out in January. So, what's this about? Well, having worked with the concept actively since the mid-1980s, and also given it much thought, I decided it would be good to formulate my experiences and to offer it all with compassion. Because I had noticed that some academics had jumped on the idea in a borderline appropriation fashion, trying to blindly define something cool in their own desperation for tenure. So that had to be rectified. But also, and here we come to the compassionate aspect, As senior magicians, we are de facto teachers, and not only to the students who come to us for guidance. If the academic worlds become interested in what we do, it is our duty to present the ideas and concepts in such a way that they can understand and include them in their own contextualizations. Although we could argue that the academic world is very much an esoteric and cultic structure, much more so than the cults some of them study with much fervor and ample irony, and that it doesn't really have much impact in the real world. I also believe no one is fully safe from possible academic misrepresentation. And what we can do then is basically to leave behind undeniable first-hand material, and then let the chips fall where they may. How this is interpreted is essentially and often unfortunately beyond our control, especially, of course, post-mortem. In the book, I describe the schematic process of occulturation, how and when something moves from the hidden to the manifest, and how we can look at basically any aspect of human culture and see that it's a given. It's almost like a formula of certainty. Things move from the hidden to the manifest, from the occult to the visible. And this goes well beyond the contemporary occultural thematics of previously ostracized esoteric wisdom becoming more or less mainstream. It can be seen in botany, biology, all arts and sciences, basically. There is pressure and seed in the underground, and the trajectory is to strive to fulfillment, usually above ground. I have tied this in with what I call source magic, meaning that all human endeavors stem from an original shamanic mind frame of transcendence. Knowledge comes from within, and when we acknowledge that, instead of clinging to conceptual Jehovahs of all cultures, we will make great progress. Everything comes from the unconscious, the individual as well as collective variant. Transcendence is the main key to realization, knowledge, and magical power, and a conscious awareness of that your existence is a unique expression of nature. These are the things that I ascribe to. No cults or funny hats needed. One of my most general ideas, which is not mine, but I have expressed it in my terms, is that creativity itself is inherently magical. To create something, a painting, a poem, a piece of music, a movie, is to engage in an act of transformation. And this process, of course, mirrors the alchemical process of solve et coagula, dissolve and recombine, in which raw materials are broken down and reconstituted into something new. For me, this principle applies not only to the creative process, but also to the broader cultural dynamics of occulture. Just as the alchemist works to transmute base metals into gold, so too does occulture transform the raw materials of human experience into something meaningful and transcendental, defined by its own time and its own needs. The key term or concept of sympathesis is a central one within magical anthropology. It basically means that whatever humans create is meant to produce its own transcendence. And this is because we have very early on been conditioned to associate the insights of transcendence with a kind of pure epistemology solidly linked to our survival instinct. This is particularly true and relevant when looking at areas involving the mind, or spirituality, religion, and magic, etc. Humans have always created more or less intricate systems that all lead up to a point of transcendence. A few examples. The banging on a drum rhythmically will set the body in motion, and continually so will allow for an ecstatic body mind frame that will provide concrete insights. Or the construction of a system or order of so-called angels and similar concoctions that will constitute suitable cathartic projection surfaces for troubled mind frames of uncertainty and fear. or the elaborate construction of symbolic pseudo-logical systems in which the symbols traditionally take on a life of their own, ultimately conveying message from divine spheres, which is basically the unconscious mind. The power of and need for transcendence is necessary for human health on all levels. Sympathesis shows us that whatever we do is essentially rooted in a primordial shamanic mind frame, and the more we can realize this on an individual level, the better. Once realized, the shamanic mind frame can easily be reintegrated. We are seeing clearly how the process that I've called occulturation becomes more and more dominant. Things move from the cultic or hidden into the mainstream, carrying signal that may be commercially diluted or palatable, but nonetheless inspires completely new audiences. One example of very many right now is the work of Charles Adams. He started out as a cartoonist and illustrator and came up with this merry bunch of macabre miscreants, the Addams family. Their humor came from cheerful amorality and domestic normalcy amid menace, knitting with live spiders, welcoming Christmas carolers with boiling cauldrons, played with perfect nonchalance. Adams refined their silhouettes, props, and settings over time. Names such as Morticia, Gomez, Wednesday, Pugsley, Uncle Fester, Grandmama, Lurch, and The Thing were largely formalized for the 1964 television adaptation, to which Adams contributed character notes and visual guidance. The TV series propelled the family into mass popular culture. Audiences received the show warmly, and reruns over the decades and DVD boxes cemented its cult status. Subsequent revivals, feature films, Broadway musical, animated films, and contemporary reinterpretations like the Wednesday TV series demonstrate the property's durable elasticity. Each iteration rebalances darkness and heart, but the core remains Adams's joke, a perfectly functional family whose interests and decor are simply macabre and decidedly occult-oriented, without ostracizing it in any way, actually rather normalizing the hocus pocus, as well as a healthy outsidership which actively avoids norm-core values and behaviors. So, why is this relevant here? Because it's gone from cultic appreciation to household phenomenon, and a highly successful one. Wednesday, some of you may have watched this show, had the second most pre-release followers of any Netflix original series, behind only The Witcher. It ultimately debuted at #1 on Netflix in 83 countries. The series holds the records of most hours viewed in a week for an English language Netflix series, with a total 341 million hours watched in its first week of release, amounting to more than 50 million households and passing prior record holder Stranger Things Season 4, which only had 335 million hours, etc., etc. Of course, real cultural impact cannot be totally quantified like this. But it is still interesting to see, especially as all the competition also handles occult or fantasy/supernatural themes. Another example, which is also tied into Tim Burton's wonderful mind, is Dark Shadows, which most of you probably know from the great film with Johnny Depp and Eva Green from 2012. But originally, Dark Shadows was an American Gothic daytime soap opera about vampires, which ran between 1966 and 71. The show created the template for serialized supernatural drama, predating later genre soaps and primetime series. And it generated a fervent fan culture. Anton LaVey recommended Dark Shadows to me, and I can certainly see why. Also, already in the Church of Satan's heyday, people made fun of the LaVey family household as if it were some kind of West Coast apparition of the Addams family. For Tim Burton, who grew up on this kind of material and also idolized the almost forgotten Universal monsters from the 1930s and horror culture in general, I think it must have been like a pressure cooker. After a while, you simply have to share all the good stuff you've experienced and loved with others. And most likely, this will be with and also for a brand new generation. In all of this occulturation, it can be easy to misinterpret magic as something abstracted, as an attribute within culture. But in actual fact, it's not an attribute, it's an essence. An essential part of something so central as the survival instinct. The ritualized behavior and meditative stances are readjustments for optimizing epistemological speed and accuracy. We need this behavior and this stance in order to survive, and perhaps extra much today, as centuries of monotheism and so-called scientific mind frames have ground down human essence and dignity to a fine powder that easily blows away in the warm winds of reactivity and communal self-hate. Some schools of philosophy and psychology like to argue that thought is inhibited action. But looking at the world today, I would argue that the other way around is also true. Action is inhibited thought. And in order to adjust the finer balance in our existential ecosystem, we need most of all to appreciate silence and subdued light, perhaps even darkness itself. Meaning, for instance, meditation and similar practices. Well-informed minds make better and wiser judgments. Wiser minds make better and more well-informed judgments, and so on. The knee that bends or the head that bows in humility in prayer should do so only in supplication of what already exists within us. To invest a basically biological or psychological process with externalized symbols and religious mechanics is already a large part of our problems and predicaments. Not having faith in your own decision-making capacities immediately leaves the field open to and for manipulation. The more tradition, the more structure, the harder it seems to trust yourself, whereas in fact all roads lead not to Rome nor to Berlin, but to the capital of your own empire, that of your enlightened mind attuned to greater nature. There is an increasing number of people becoming active on an assortment of what we could call magical paths today. And this is a concrete result of a culture in which thematically spiritual or esoteric or magical strains are more visible than ever before. And this, of course, affects culture in the other direction too, as these people start creating a culture of their own. This very conference is an example of exactly this kind of membrane-like manifestation in which things can pass through in both directions, yet the membrane remains intact and strong. I would argue that this is extremely healthy on individual levels of Gnostic insight, methodical individuation, transcendental approaches to knowledge and to empowerment. But it can also become problematic on collective levels when attempts at possession of avenues, methods, core teachings, etc. become battlegrounds for twisted group dynamics. We have seen this time and time again, not only in the history of magical groups, but also in contemporary monotheistic cults that gladly kill off their competition while claiming compassion and surreal innocence. I think in essence it's a problem of individual versus collective. If a collective doesn't consist of fully individuals alone, there will be problems. And here, of course, unfortunately, we know that such a utopian concept has never existed in consensus reality. One of the keys to the future of the dissemination of healthy ideas is an openness in the prerogative to interpret and document. This is where we as practitioners in these wonderfully exciting times have to cock very critical eyes on academia, if we find it worth a while and energy, that is. Over the past decades, part of an abstracted occulturation has been the emergence of academic focus on magic and esoterica. I would guess that a majority of the students and teachers have a background in some sort of magical practice or non-academic interest. In a way, this has helped the important occulturation in the sense of objectively validating a field of knowledge and activities that is the most quintessentially human there is, magic, and from which all other activities and fields of study emerge. Let's not forget that the first tenet or statement within magical anthropology is, magic is. But academia itself not only harnesses a method of scrutiny and validation that reduces complex phenomena to attempts at quantifying the intangible. It is also inherently a cultic environment in which a pyramidal power structure squeezes out homogeneity and orderly adaptation to the system. And if one doesn't adapt, there will be no acronymic rewards, no grants, no tenure, and no funny hats. There are many similarities here to many of the cults that they themselves study, scrutinize, and make ironic comments about. Very little of what's produced within academia has the power to reach outside the cult, and this actually constitutes another huge problem. What is produced remains esoteric and interreferential within a small and limited community. However, from the point of view of history writing, this can still cause problems in the future. Because if we accept academic errors because they seem insignificant or minor today, this might not be the case in the future. Basically, this is all about information and how we look at it. Of course, this can be done in different ways. A practitioner might look at a certain text as possible fodder or inspiration or for ritual, which will be filled by emotion, transcendentalism, and pure Gnostic information. An academic scholar might look at the same text as written by so-and-so, who was in the context of this or that, and potentially signifying that or this, and maybe integrating a brave theory saying it's beyond mere conjecture that this text may be inspired by this related text by another. But what if the authors of these two texts are still alive and willing to talk about the actual meaning of the texts from distinctly magical perspectives and thus may contradict the scholar's intentions? Any creative person or pursuit, and make no mistake, magic is hyper-creative, will be subject to scrutiny and criticism. That's just the name of the game. But in a normal creative field, this is usually based in subjective points of view in which the reviewer becomes a predictable brand, him or herself. Within academia, the subjective is cleverly clothed in objective garb, diverting counter-critical attention to a defense system of method and peer reviews. But who are the peers of the peers, so-called? Let's quote Juvenalis from his satires. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who watches the watchman. Now, believe it or not, it is not my intention to be too overly critical. In this important era of undeniable occulturation, everyone has at least a potential part to play. The more material that is published and out there about magical ideas and pioneers, the better. People are still capable of making up their own minds, and what they're usually looking for is not so much hard data information as it is inspiration within their own individuation. And here, the academic output falls a little bit short. In scrutiny, academics can certainly deconstruct and find objective errors in Blavatsky, Crowley, Steiner, Castaneda, Kenneth Grant, or whoever, basically, but it won't really change a thing. The writings of these magicians will always inspire new generations because of their fanciful and ingenious ways of connecting cosmic dots and elevating the readers to do the same, both in theory and practice. It's essentially shamanism by literary proxy, and I believe this is not only good, but also necessary at this point in time. I have no choice but to be myself, and that feels like a great privilege. I am a pathfinder and a source of inspiration, but that's really all connected to my own sense of being. It is not a construct. I don't do it for specifically altruistic reasons, but it all still has altruistic effects. The mystery is just another concept to provide meaning for those who can't find pleasure and peace in their own moment. It comes from trying too hard to define the undefinable, and in words, much better left undefined yet experienced. The highest magic is to actively embrace the ideal and to continue unfolding within that. And this can, of course, mean different things to different people, but the core or key is essentially the same. Honest and continual self-assessment conquers hocus-pocus shenanigans and obsessive systems any day, any night. Kenneth Anger taught me the approaches and value of talismanic art making. Anton LaVey taught me the value of absolute honesty in assessing unique individual identity and all its life-enhancing satellites and expressions, passionately embracing the ideal. Genesis P-Orridge taught me not only the value, but also the importance of lovingly manipulating outer reality so that it can be filled with more constructive building blocks, also for others. Other magicians have taught me other things, but most of these are genuinely occult and should remain so, because, make no mistake, there is power in silence and a hermetic approach. They are extremely important tools in the toolbox. But I do believe the activation of occultural assault is needed in these potential end times to present real human ingenuity and initiative. My spirit is called freedom, and it is challenging in every sense. Of course, those who cannot or dare not face themselves in the mirror are opposed to this freedom. It's an ongoing battle that will never really end, and that is probably as it should be. And that's a good Crowley gem that I like from the Book of the Law. Choose ye an island. I have chosen my island, and I'm happily fortifying it, mainly with more books. Thank you.